My Personal Recollections of Thomas Troward by Harry Gaze. Chapter 5. The Teachings of Thomas Troward. As Thomas Troward came into contact with the public and the New Thought lecturers visiting England, he added more method to his messages. He realized the impact of the realistic idealism taught by teachers of the New Thought truths. He had often talked to groups gathering at the Higher Thought Center. Now the greater task came for him in public lectures. The place chosen was Edinburgh, Scotland. The Quakers had an available little hall on Queen Street in this historic city. It was a somewhat drab hall, built on their early austere pattern. The lectures were given in 1904. It was quite in contrast with the handsome Friends Meeting House opposite Euston Street Station, London, with its 1,200 very comfortable lounge chairs instead of the hard, straight seats on which the solemn audience of Thomas Troward sat. Mr. Troward had chosen mental science as the subject of his lecture. Some very thoughtful and appreciative people had gathered to hear him, but there were a number of others who thought it too deep and profound and too far above their heads. On this occasion he had brought a carefully prepared and somewhat voluminous manuscript. His theme was reasoned out with logical skill and gave evidence of great learning. The manuscript was somewhat in the way of some of the would-be hearers, especially as the style of delivery was quiet and introspective rather than dynamic. One anxious little lady, who, with some effort, caught a sentence now and then, afterward congratulated Mr. Troward on his wisdom and beauty of thought, but said, "What little we heard," speaking for herself and those in the neighboring seats, "was wonderfully good. Why don't you have it printed and published so that we can get it all and thoroughly understand it?" Though partly amused, the more Mr. Troward heard similar remarks from others, the more the idea of the little lady appealed to him. And the idea was one that turned out for the good of thousands and generations yet to be born. Lectures may soon be forgotten, but many books live on to be read and reread, as in the case of Thomas Troward. While he continued, whenever sufficiently persuaded, to lecture after rather long intervals, and it always required very strong persuasion, it was as a writer that he eventually became world famous. This first book was entitled The Edinburgh Lectures on Mental Science. The interest in England was sufficient to justify the writing of other books. In America, there was a still greater interest. A whole series of books by Troward appeared. Several followed a course of lectures. A number of books by various authors have appeared in America that have been compiled and edited from stenographic or tape records of lectures or sermons, and these, of course, have had to be carefully pruned, as they were often given in spontaneous and colloquial style. A lecture by Thomas Troward, though perhaps not so entertaining to an audience in a popular sense, was in itself a finished literary production, covering accurately all the whys and wherefores of the subject. For this reason, it was excellent material for books. Naturally, in a lecture the speaker frequently repeats to reach and impress his audience. Such repetition would not be given when the speech is written in detail in advance for a book. If necessary, sentences can be read and reread. In the 15 years in which Thomas Troward produced his literature, he wrote, in addition to the Edinburgh Lectures on Mental Science, the Doré Lectures on Mental Science, the Creative Process in the Individual, Bible Mystery and Bible Meaning, the Law and the Word, and the Hidden Power. Footnote: The Hidden Power is a posthumous collection of essays named after the essay of the same title. The book is now available as Collected Essays of Thomas Troward. Also his comments on the Psalms. Troward's comments on the Psalms, also posthumous, gathers Troward's marginal notations entered in the Book of Psalms in his personal Bible. The first named should preferably be read first, and to serious students, the whole series will be a gradual necessity. The lectures on mental science delivered by Mr. Troward in the historic city of Edinburgh came 3 years after the Gifford Lectures in Edinburgh, which were delivered by William James of Harvard University. Those given by Professor James were published in book form, being the famous Varieties of Religious Experience. In these lectures, he explained what he very aptly named the religion of healthy-mindedness. Under this title, he presented the subjects of new thought and mind healing. These lectures of William James, dealing with the subconscious mind and psychology in connection with studies in healing, metaphysics, and mysticism, were delivered before an academic audience. The remarkable feature of these discourses was that he addressed leaders, professors, and university students across the seas on New Thought teachings as early as 1901 and 1902. As Thomas Troward was then quite unknown to fame, the New Thought authorities quoted by Professor James were Ralph Waldo Emerson, Dr. Richard M. Buck, Dr. Horatio Dresser, Henry Wood, and Ralph Waldo Trine. The Gifford Lectures of William James received good publicity not only in Edinburgh and London, but also in America. This presented Mr. Troward and his associates the idea of giving a much more detailed explanation and application of the laws of mind as they pertain to healing, happiness, and the unfoldment of mental and spiritual powers. And again, Scotland was chosen for this activity. Unlike Professor James, however, Mr. Troward was quite unknown to the academic circles that welcomed his predecessor as a famous college professor and lecturer, whose work offered an extension of psychology into the sphere of definite application to life. Not all of James's ideas met with hearty reception. There were some who disapproved of the emphasis on practical results. They favored what was termed a pure psychology, existing for the sake of fine learning, and also a more physiological psychology. The greatest result was not in the immediate contact with the audiences in Edinburgh, though some acclaimed the innovation suggested. Through his books, Professor James reached multitudes of people. This was also true in the case of Thomas Troward's lecturing and writing, although the results in the welcome of his books were much slower in coming. William James had an immediate public for his Varieties of Religious Experience, and his Psychology for Teachers also became a classic. With Mr. Troward's writing, however, his popularity after more than half a century was never as great as right now, and is still increasing. One reason for the ascendancy of the Edinburgh Lecture series over many of the more modern New Thought books was the complete independence of Mr. Troward from the competitive publication of today. They were written purely with a view to adequately treat the subject and give detailed and often abstract reasoning, regardless of immediate public interest in sales. Mr. Troward was not called upon to support his work as a profession. In the long run, Mr. Troward's detailed and judicial examination of the subject has won the approval of the most thoughtful students and made them standard textbooks. In later years, William James, the eminent philosopher and psychologist of Harvard University, warmly praised the books of Thomas Troward in these words, "Far and away the ablest statement of the philosophy I have met, beautiful in its sustained clearness of thought and style, a really classic statement." In the Edinburgh Lectures on Mental Science, Troward explains the principles that rule the relation between the action of the mind and the resulting conditions in the physical body. This is an excellent basis for the more complete study of the mind. Of absorbing interest is Mr. Troward's statement concerning the relation of intelligence and livingness. He says, "In whatever way we turn the subject, we shall always find that what we call the livingness of any individual life is ultimately measured by its intelligence. The higher the intelligence, the more completely the mode of motion is under its control. And as we descend in the scale of intelligence, the descent is marked by a corresponding increase in automatic motion, not subject to the control of a self-conscious intelligence." Mr. Troward then proceeds to explain the practical methods by which this higher mode of intelligence can control the lower. In my books, How to Live Forever, 1904 edition, and The Science of Physical Immortality, published in 1899, I explained that the key to the control of life, permanent health, and immortality is conscious cooperation with the law in individual evolution. This I explained to Thomas Troward in my London classes and in personal interview lessons in the year 1903. That he saw the merit of this formula and accepted it is shown in Chapter 2 of the Edinburgh Lectures on Mental Science. He says, "At this stage, the all-creating life principle reproduces itself in a form capable of recognizing the working of the evolutionary law, and the unity and continuity of purpose running through the whole progression until now indicates beyond a doubt that the place of such a being in the universal scheme must be to introduce the operation of that factor which, up to this point, has been conspicuous by its absence, the factor, namely, of intelligent individual volition. The evolution which has brought us up to this standpoint has been a process in which the individual himself has not taken a conscious part. To evolve further, it can now only be by his own conscious cooperation with the law. His evolution in the future must be by conscious participation in the great work. In the 1904 edition of my book, How to Live Forever, one chapter is entitled Conscious Evolution, the Key to Immortality. In this chapter I state, between the man of today and the man of the future, there is as vast a difference as now exists between the lowest amoeba and man. He will improve in form as he learns to lay aside the shackles of the mature consciousness, and will ever see new opportunities for growth. He must become a conscious factor in evolution. Some scientists declare that man has reached the limit of physical evolution, but this theory is mistaken. Evolution is a fact of the present as well as the past. In the Edinburgh Lectures, in the chapter Subjective and Objective Mind, the nature of which was prompted by Mr. Troward's study of the books of Thompson J. Hudson, he says, the phenomena of hypnosis are now so fully recognized as established scientific fact that it is quite superfluous to discuss the question of their credibility. He also explains, the great truth which the science of hypnotism has brought to light is the dual nature of the human mind. A long series of careful experiments by highly trained observers, some of them men of worldwide reputation, has fully established certain remarkable differences between the action of the subjective and that of the objective mind. Chief of these differences, Mr. Troward states, are the methods by which the two phases of mind reason. Perhaps the most important fact which hypnotic experiments have demonstrated is that the subjective mind is the builder of the body. Whatever personality the objective mind impresses upon it, that personality it assumes and acts up to. And since it is the builder of the body, it will build up a body in correspondence with the personality thus impressed upon it. These two laws of the subjective mind form the foundation of the axiom that our body represents the aggregate of our beliefs. Mr. Troward carefully distinguishes between the absolute and the relative. He speaks of the existence in the spiritual world of a spiritual prototype of every existing thing, which he likens to Emanuel Swedenborg's doctrine of correspondences and Plato's doctrine of archetypal ideas. This idea was embodied in what I referred to in early years as the mental or spiritual equivalent, and my student, Emmett Fox, wrote a pamphlet on this theme, which now forms a chapter in one of his books. In the Edinburgh Lectures, Mr. Troward carefully differentiates between the nature of cause and conditions, the latter so often being mistaken for causes. Other interesting subjects are intuition, healing the body, the will, the soul, and the spirit. Bible mystery and Bible meaning is termed an interpretation of Bible truths from the standpoint of modern metaphysics. The lovers of the Bible in the New and Old Testaments should find this a veritable revelation of light and reason. The story of the creation and the fall, as viewed by Mr. Troward, gives a revolutionary concept and brings the story boldly into the action of the present. The mission of Moses and the mission of Jesus will throw a flood of illumination on the subjects discussed. The power of the name and the word is so clarified that the knowledge gained will be a real source of increased livingness. The treatment of the topics of givingness and forgivingness will show a path of freedom to many. The supreme subject of the I Am is a rich contribution to the study and application of metaphysical truth. The thoughtful reader learns how Christ healed and how we may also heal. It is comparatively rare now to find men and women who fully believe in immortal life, here and now, in mind and body as well as spirit. It was even more rare when I first met Mr. Troward 55 years ago. Even 5 years before meeting my friend, I had written on the possibility of natural immortality and eternal youth, and lectured and held classes devoted to this possibility in many towns and cities of the United States. It was a joy, therefore, to find a man a deep philosopher with a normally conservative mind like Thomas Troward, who accepted no idea unless it corresponded with both his reason and intuition, freely accepting the idea of living forever. At first he listened thoughtfully and silently, and only sponsored the idea after much study and contemplation. He found eventually that it was soundly based on the principles of spiritual and mental science as he had accepted them, and in harmony with the highest word of the Scriptures. When I presented the idea of perpetual life to Mr. Troward, he challenged me at every possible point: physiological, philosophical, biological, psychological, and spiritual. His ultimate conclusion about the matter is best stated in the opening chapter of Bible Mystery and Bible Meaning. It reads as follows: "The Bible is the book of the emancipation of man. The emancipation of man means his deliverance from sorrow and sickness, from poverty, struggle, and uncertainty, from ignorance and limitation, and finally from death itself." This may appear to be what the euphemistic colloquialism of the day would call a tall order, but nevertheless it is impossible to read the Bible with a mind unwarped by antecedent conceptions, derived from traditional interpretation, without seeing that this is exactly what it promises, and that it professes to contain the secret whereby this happy condition of perfect liberty may be attained. Jesus says that if a man keeps his saying, he shall never see death. John 8:51. In the book of Job, we are told that if a man has with him a messenger, an interpreter, he shall be delivered from going down to the pit, and shall return to the days of his youth. Job 33:23, 24. The Psalms speak of our renewing our youth. Psalm 103:5. Now, what I propose is that we shall reread the Bible on the supposition that Jesus and these other speakers really meant what they said. The Edinburgh Lectures on mental science continued the subjects discussed in the Edinburgh Lectures on mental science and richly clarified and extended the teaching. These lectures were delivered at the Doré Art Gallery, from which the book took its name. In this book, Mr. Troward wisely says, "Now death is the absence of life, and disease is the absence of health. So, to enter into the spirit of life, we require to contemplate it, where it is to be found, and not where it is not. We are met with the old question, why seek ye the living among the dead?" This is why we start our studies by considering the cosmic creation, for it is there that we find the life spirit working through untold ages, not merely as deathless energy, but with a perpetual advance into higher degrees of life. If we could only so enter into the spirit as to make it personally in ourselves what it evidently is in itself, the magnum opus would be accomplished. This means realizing our life as drawn direct from the originating spirit. If we have grasped the idea of the spirit as the great forming power, we shall seek it in the fountainhead of form as well as of power. This is in perfect harmony with the affirmation which I have given my audiences for their audible repetition for 60 years. I realize that I am an ever-renewing and ever-unfolding expression of the infinite life. The harmony of this statement with the concept of Mr. Troward is shown by his sublime words. Our path, therefore, is plain. It is simply to contemplate the life, love, and beauty of the originating spirit, and affirm that we are already giving expression to it in our thought. It ever grows wider and mounts higher, for it is the continually expanding expression of the life of the spirit, which is infinite and knows no limits. Another wonderful book by Thomas Troward is The Creative Process in the Individual, in which he explains the conception of progressive evolution. He tells his purpose in this interesting and valuable book. In the present volume, I have endeavored to set before the reader the conception of a sequence of creative action, commencing with the formation of the globe and culminating in a vista of infinite possibilities attainable by everyone who follows up the right line for their unfoldment. And if our speculations lead us to the conclusion that we have reached a point where we are not only able, but also required by the law of our own being, to take a more active part in our personal evolution than heretofore, this discovery will afford us a new outlook upon life and widen our horizon with fresh interests and brightening hopes. Our work, Mr. Troward tells us, is to individualize spirit. He expresses it concisely in these words: "It is the individualizing of the universal spirit by recognizing its reciprocity to ourselves that is the secret of the perpetuation and growth of our own individuality." He quotes St. John as summing up the whole of this position in saying, "Beloved, now are we the sons of God, and it doth not yet appear what we shall be. But we know that when he shall appear, i.e., become clear to us, we shall be like him, for, i.e., the reason of all this, we shall see him as he is." John 3:2. In the manifestation of the life principle in The Creative Process, Mr. Troward states clearly his belief in living forever, naturally as well as spiritually. He says, "The principle thus being universal, there is no reason why we should postpone its application till we find ourselves in another world, and the best place and time to begin are here and now. The spiritual ego in ourselves, as proceeding direct from the universal spirit, should be able first to so harmoniously combine the working of spiritual and physical laws in its own body as to keep it in perfect health. Secondly, to carry this process further and renew the body, thus eradicating the effects of old age. And thirdly, to carry the process still further and perpetuate this renewed body as long as the individual might desire." In view of these advanced ideas on life and death, why did Thomas Troward die? For most people, there would be no necessity of answering this question. The established belief, with comparatively few exceptions, is that everyone must die sometime. The question, however, is not irrelevant in the case of Thomas Troward, and as he repeatedly wrote of the scientific possibility of living forever, in body as well as in soul and spirit, this trite question requires a thoughtful answer. One very natural answer is that when a new and great discovery is made, it is not usually demonstrated in its early stages, but becomes the subject of much experimentation and often results in temporary failures. While recognizing the validity of this argument as fully covering the loss of the body on the part of many, there are still further questions to be asked in the case of Mr. Troward. If we do not, or only partially, answer these questions, his passing becomes a source of negative suggestion to his followers. As a matter of fact, most of his followers ignore this part of his teaching and often concentrate on minor points of his findings, or they seek to give an interpretation of his writings on immortality which entirely takes the vital life out of them. I would like first to quote from one of his later books, The Law and the Word. In this fine book, Mr. Troward amplifies his ideas concerning the overcoming of death. His views on this all-important subject combine both the records of the scriptures and the science of his day. He tells us that death and taxes are popularly quoted as being inevitable. He acknowledges that this has been true of past conditions, but wisely observes, the question is, are they really inherent in the essential nature of things, or are they not the outcome of our past, limited and often inverted modes of thought? Death is not in the essence of man's creation. In speaking of the action of the subjective mind and the sympathetic nerve system, Mr. Troward tells us, now it is through this inner builder of the body that our thought reacts upon our physical organism. The response is purely automatic for the simple reason that there is no original thinking or power in the three lower principles. The action is that of the law, as directed by thought or word. Although endorsing the idea of complete immortality, that is spiritual, mental, and physical, in logical principle, and showing that the great secret would be in using our thought and word power to impress the subjective mind with the essential conviction of this complete immortality based upon the knowledge of the nature of the spirit and our relationship with the spirit, he nevertheless used the law of negative suggestion of death to impress his own mind. And remember again that, according to his own doctrine, the subjective builder would be compelled to accept the thought and word it received. It was in quoting St. Paul and telling of immediate living resurrection that he made a digression to negative but effective prophecy for himself and others. Here are his own words. Well, St. Paul is dead and buried, and so I suppose will most of us be in a few years, so the question confronts us, what becomes of us then? The answer to this question, therefore, why did Thomas Troward die, is clear as daylight. Whatever the immediate condition of his parting, on the plane of deeper causation, he died because of his habitual expectation of the event, as clearly revealed by his published words. He believed the full immortality was an ultimate possibility. He accepted the full idea in principle, but rejected his personal demonstration. We gain additional light on the thinking of Thomas Troward from the creative process in the individual, in which he says, race thought, simply as such, is opposed to the attempt of the individual to pass into a higher order of life. It limits him by strong currents of negative suggestion, based on the fallacy that the perpetuation of the race requires the death of the individual. Mr. Troward then tells us how we may actually use this negative power of race thought. He does this by destroying it with its own weapon, that is, by finding in the race nature itself the very material to be used by the Spirit for building up the new man. This is a discovery on the spiritual plane equivalent to the discovery on the physical plane that we can make iron float by the same law by which it sinks. Mr. Troward then proceeds to show in what way we may find the neutrality of matter just as amenable to the law of life as to the law of death. The essential purpose in the teaching of Thomas Troward is to show that death as we know it, somatic death, the form of death that makes the undertaker necessary, may be overcome. He endeavored to prove that this eternal livingness would be accompanied by supreme joy, a life of spiritual ecstasy and contemplation, permanent strength, youth, and beauty. The occasional cure of disease by the powers of mind and spirit with eventual failure did not fit in with his sense of logic. On the other hand, owing to a certain clinging to traditional thought and reference to the experience of others, he entertained and openly expressed doubts of his own individual attainment, which he thought so extremely desirable. His very humility, so much admired, together with the streak of conservatism that remained, caused him to shrink from the positive confidence in a personal demonstration which is absolutely essential to success. This essential manifestation of the sons of God in eternal life and youth requires uncompromising daring. It requires this absolutely fearless affirmation to make a sufficiently dynamic impact on the subconscious mind. Only in this way can one adequately engage its building and biochemical power for physical transformation and regeneration. It should be said, however, that his brave efforts and his knowledge would give him a tremendous trend toward livingness and well-being in a new incarnation, whether on this earth or elsewhere. No good effort is ever lost or wasted, and he, together with the multitudes he has helped, will continue to be blessed by the life science teachings he adopted in principle and gave to the world in his lectures and writings in the famous Edinburgh series. While Mr. Troward follows with some speculation concerning survival after death, he vigorously comes back to the original faith in complete immortality and helpfulness to others not yet awakened to the majestic conception of the life victorious. In this connection, he says, "But perhaps you will say, why should we want to have anything more to do with the physical plane? Surely we have had enough of it already." Yes, in its old sense of limitation, but not in the new sense of a world of glorious possibilities, a new field for our creative activities, not the least of which is the helping of those who are still in those lower stages which we have already passed through. I think if we realize the position of the fully risen man, we shall see that he is not likely to turn his back upon the earth as a rotten old thing. Therefore, a new physical body is a necessary part of his equipment. The Law and the Word, Chapter 7. Mr. Troward visualized this transformed body as possessing amazing powers and qualities. He advises, however, that the word that can thus set in motion the law of life and make it triumph over the law of death cannot be spoken by the limited personality which only knows itself as John Smith or Mary Jones. By whom, then, must the word be spoken? Mr. Troward maintains that it must be spoken by the Christ man, for he concludes this thought-provoking chapter with these words: "The word that we speak with this recognition is no longer ours, but his who sent us, the expression on the plane of individuality of the thought that sent us into existence, and so it is the word of life. This is the true resurrection of the individual." Following the passing of Mr. Troward, Mrs. Annie Troward brought forward her husband's notes on the Psalms, and these were incorporated in a special work entitled Troward's Comments on the Psalms. This book included a special foreword by Mrs. Troward, informative but deeply touching in nature. She says, in part, "When he, Mr. Troward, retired from the Bengal civil service in 1896, he decided to devote himself to 3 objects: the study of the Bible, writing his books, and painting pictures. These occupations so filled his time, till his death in 1916, that the days never seemed long enough for him. Those who did not know him may think it strange that a man's most absorbing interest should be the study of the Bible. For him, however, it was the most wonderful book in the world, containing the keys of all the mysteries of earth, and he believed that the solution of all our problems was there for those who read and meditated with minds at one with its inspirer. He summed this up in the opening words of his book, Bible Mystery and Bible Meaning, published in 1905, when he said, "The Bible is the book of the emancipation of man. The emancipation of man means his deliverance from sorrow and sickness, from poverty, struggle, and uncertainty, from ignorance and limitation, and finally, from death itself." His Bible lies before me, large, heavy, its faded dark green cloth cover ragged at the edges and torn at the spine, nearly all its worn pages showing numerous underlinings in blue and red. There are many footnotes written in ink, and countless pages of notes are pasted in throughout. The book had belonged to his mother, and this gave it a personal value no other copy could have. Sometimes he would remain downstairs long after we had all gone to bed, and I have frequently found him on his knees before it, lost in meditation and prayer. He made a practice of studying one psalm carefully every day, whatever other portions of the Bible he might also choose to read. This story of Mrs. Troward's gives a vivid and intimate picture of Mr. Troward in his own home life. Among the favorite selections from the Psalms, he especially loved the following: "Bless the Lord, O my soul, and forget not all his benefits, who forgiveth all thine iniquities, who healeth all thy diseases, who redeemeth thy life from destruction, who crowneth thee with loving kindness and tender mercies, who satisfieth thy mouth with good things, so that thy youth is renewed like the eagles." Psalm 103.